Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Galucki, having technical difficulties. And welcome to the 385th Imagine Buffalo program and another great virtual Imagine lecture hosted by the downtown Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. Thank you so much for joining us today. This program is created by the Center for the Study of Art, Architecture, History, and Nature, or Cezanne, as I call it, and ImagineLifelongLearning.com. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you all about the library's free virtual Indie Author Day program this Saturday, November 7th. This should be a wonderful, enriching program with tips about publishing and writing a book with great input from local authors. Now, to register, you have to call the library at 858-8900. That's 858-8900. We're going to start with our speaker shortly, but first, a little housekeeping. Everyone watching will be muted during our speaker's presentation, which will last about 15 minutes. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. If you have a question, please type it into the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can. This program is being recorded. You'll be able to watch it again later on the library's Facebook and the library's YouTube channel pages. As a reminder, we'll be here on Zoom every Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. with a great lineup of local speakers. The Imagine series, the Imagine Buffalo series, focuses on a different Cezanne pillar each Tuesday. Today being the first Tuesday of the month, we look at the arts and creativity, and our featured speaker is Jane Fisher. Dr. Fisher holds a PhD in English literature from Cornell University and has been a professor in the Canisius College English department for over 30 years. She regularly teaches courses in literature and literary modernism, World War I culture, and medical humanities. Her publications include a book on the 1918 influenza pandemic entitled Envisioning Disease, Gender and War, Women's Narratives of the 1918 Influenza Pandemic. We hope to invite Jane Fisher back early next year to talk about that subject. She is currently writing a book about how World War I soldiers became reimagined as Gothic figures in literature, poetry, and film. And now let's welcome Dr. Jane Fisher, who will be talking about African-American soldiers in World War I. Jane?
Hi, everybody. It's great to see you all today, and very nice to see some familiar faces. Just wanted to shout out to Darby and Abby here, joining from quite a distance. I have a PowerPoint with me to talk about African-American soldiers in World War I. They're the sort of forgotten soldiers of World War I. And at the centennial of the war, it's really important to remember them and their contributions. So I'm going to go to my PowerPoint now. Share screen is not working here. Here we go. And I've entitled this African American World War I Soldiers, Hellfighters and Hometown Heroes, because I'm going to be talking a lot about the African American soldiers from here in New York State because they're so exemplary. And somehow my PowerPoint disappeared. Hold on. Let's just try this again because it worked before. Here we go. These soldiers are very interesting because unlike other African-American soldiers in other wars, they fought internationally. They were very public figures in France where they fought, and it changed the course of their lives, and to some extent, the course of American society was changed through their participation. Well, in my first slide here, I have some images from Buffalo. On the left, this is the Buffalo Parade welcoming all of the returning soldiers in 1919 as they came home. And on the right is Jesse W. Clipper, who I see as our sort of hometown hero, and we'll hear a lot more about him as the talk goes on. I'm just going to have to manually, I think, do my slides. On the left here, we have the better known New York's 369th, the Harlem Hellfighters. And this is their sort of glamour shot right after they won the French medal, the Croix de Guerre. They were the most decorated troops in the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. They are really the sort of stuff of legend and Hollywood movies. There's been a graphic novel written about them. There's a documentary about them. Will Smith signed on to do a Hollywood film about them, but that hasn't quite come together. They were organized as the New York 15th National Guard, so they got a chance to train together, develop an enormous esprit de corps before they went over to France. And I think that helped them quite a bit. But they became genuine heroes in the eyes of the French people and are really quite feared by the German army. And we'll hear about some of their exploits a little bit later. But why did it matter that there were so many African-American soldiers in World War I? Why were they willing to volunteer? And what did their participation in the military add to American society? African-American World War I soldiers reinforced the work of Black educators, professionals, civil rights leaders by providing meritocratic models of African-American Black citizens. War has always been a way to sort of prove your manhood, to gain equal citizenship. It was that way during the Revolutionary War, where Crispus Attucks was the first person to be killed in Boston. African Americans served in the Civil War. But this was a particular war where there was an enormous burst of pride and patriotism as the US finally moved into the war in 1917. What was especially interesting about African American participation was the strong international ties to France that these troops forged. So you have here on the left, these are medical doctors at Fort Des Moines, Iowa in 1917, a whole group of African American doctors. There were also groups of African American nurses who served in the war as well. These are some of the recruitment posters. The one on the left was published as a recruitment poster saying, "Colored man is no slacker." The one on the right was actually published after the war as a commemorative poster. And it shows Abraham Lincoln, some of the history of African Americans in the military in the US. And then you see here at the right, the participation in World War I with the German troops being taken. Enlisting in the Army seemed the best hope for full citizenship, and thus there was almost no use for these recruitment posters. African Americans turned out to aid their country and in time themselves. And here you've got troops enlisting at Camp Funston, Kansas in 1917. This, by the way, was ground zero for that influenza pandemic. And these are more Missouri troops enlisting. So they didn't just come from Harlem or from Buffalo. They came from all over the country in really large numbers. And I have some photographs here that were taken. And I just think they're so poignant. They're very hard to find, by the way. There's not a lot of material about African American soldiers in archives. I think families probably kept the photographs, the diaries, the medals especially. It's hard to find these artifacts. So we have Aaron Fisher on the right. He already has his medals pinned. Private Joe Jones on the left. no medals there. Maybe this was his photo taken before he went over. This is a whole group, and I really love the way they wanted their photo taken together. It shows a really strong bond, a kind of esprit de corps. I wasn't able to get the names of these soldiers. He has some fruit salad, as they say. He has some conduct and participation ribbons there. Oops, come back here, come back here. The person on the left, Private Eddie Riley, wants to have his photo taken sitting down. The person on the right has captured the attention of several biographers, and there's at least 2 good biographies of him out right now. He is Eugene Bullard, and he was the very first African-American pilot to serve in the military. And he's a very interesting person. You can see from his very erect posture and the way he addresses the camera that he has a great deal of confidence. But the aviators were the glamorous flyboys of World War I, and he participated in that. Often when I describe to people my research project, they say, do you mean the Tuskegee Airmen? That's World War II. These African-American soldiers were real pioneers in World War I. These are some Tin Pan Alley songs. The Colored Soldier Boys of Uncle Sam, We're Coming. And Young Black Joe, Let Me Take My Gal With Me. And this was also published, I think, after the battles, which I'll be describing in a few minutes. This is more of a commemorative poster as well. The reality facing African-American soldiers in World War I differed dramatically from the propaganda posters. All were initially assigned to support duties, such as unloading ships, leading pack mules through the mud, digging latrines. And this was a big disappointment to them. They had joined the Army to fight, to prove themselves as men. They immediately faced racism in the US military, in their training, especially in Texas. There were a number of riots. And racism in the US military prevented them from fighting until General Jack Pershing agreed to loan parts of 2 units, the 92nd and 93rd Infantry, to the French, who desperately needed reinforcements in northeast France, north of Verdun, up near the Luxembourg border. And he loaned the African-American units. Pershing had made an agreement that he would never give his troops over to foreign management, mainly because the French and British generals had not done such a good job in the war up to date. But under hard pressure, he agreed he would lend them some of the African-American troops. And this commemorative poster, labeled Our Colored Heroes, shows the African-American troops fighting the Germans hand to hand, which is exactly what happened up there in the Argonne Forest near the Luxembourg border. But initially, they were assigned to mules, to loading mules. The postcard reads, "The Army mules with their big packs strapped so strongly on their backs remind me what I wish to do, to send a pack of greetings to you." They were assigned initially to regiments of African colonial troops, such as the Senegalese tirailleurs. These were the sharpshooters, the riflemen. This is a very important part of their experience, actually. These troops did not speak French. Imagine coming from Harlem, coming from Missouri, coming from Michigan Avenue in Buffalo, and you're in France, and suddenly there you are. You're put down in a regiment of colonial troops who speak patois French, or other troops who speak French, and you're under fire, and you have to learn how to speak French very, very quickly. And what impressed the French and really endeared these troops to the French is they learned to speak French in 2 or 3 days. They learned to speak French very, very quickly. And the African American troops liked the French because they did not share the racism of the US military. And these are the Senegalese troops, you know, giving the Germans what they deserve, a good sharp rifle, a good sharp bayonet right there in the hindquarters. And these are the Senegalese troops at, you know, being reviewed. Here's some more French postcards. This shows a successful Senegalese soldier with the German pointed helmets stacked up. And another one talks about red cross and black head, hearts of gold. African American troops fought in the crucial final 100 days of the war, cutting the German supply lines and preventing them from taking Paris. And I've got a map here so you can really see where they fought. They fought in extremely rough, muddy terrain. The German troops, the stormtroopers, were going straight ahead trying to take Paris. And they thought they might actually be winning the war. The problem was their supply lines right up here on the border were being cut. And they were being cut, many of them, by the African-American soldiers. On the left here, you can see the high-tech French Army lookouts climbing a tree, trying to see what's going on. But the weather was treacherous, the terrain was terrible. I've tried to visit some of these battlefields, and they're just muddy hills. You really can't even visit them today. And it's not because of the armament or the bombing or anything. It's just really, really treacherous. So here are some photos of these troops in France. Here they are marching to battle. You can see the camouflage netting there up between the trees. And this one is a really interesting photo on the right, because not only did the 365th, the Harlem Hellfighters, fight under French command, they wore French uniforms, at least partially French uniforms. They were true hybrid soldiers. And you can see these are French helmets that they're wearing here as they're lined up. This is a drawing, a simulation of what the fighting would have been like in the Argonne Forest, the blasted trees. My experience of the Argonne Forest is that it's not that flat. It's pretty much straight up and straight down. But that's a good simulation. The New York 369th went by many names. They called themselves the Black Rattlers, and this is their patch that they wore on the far right. Their French allies called them Men of Bronze, and that is not a reference to their skin pigmentation. It's a quote from Napoleon. Napoleon said that ordinary men stayed home, men of iron died. I only brought back with me from battle men of bronze. So that's a very high compliment. Their German enemies called them Hellfighters because of their fierceness in battle. They prided themselves on spending 191 days in combat, longer than any other American unit. They never lost a trench to the enemy or a man to capture. And I think that speaks of their esprit de corps. They were a band of brothers. They did not want to leave anyone behind to be captured and put in a German prisoner of war camp. They became the most highly decorated unit in the entire American Expeditionary Force. Max Brooks wrote a graphic novel about them that I've taught in my classes, and this is from the graphic novel. They were part of the force that captured the Hindenburg Line, which was one of the major Allied goals of the entire war. This is an old stereoscope slide, but you can see how exhausted they were. This is the big hero of the Harlem Hellfighters, Sergeant Henry Lincoln Johnson. This is just after he was awarded the French Croix de Guerre, the Cross of War, the very highest honor of the French government. He had been employed as a railroad porter before the war, but he rose in rank on the battlefield. He was posthumously awarded the U.S. Medal of Honor by President Obama in May 2015. He single-handedly killed a number of Germans, allowing his fellow soldiers to avoid capture and be rescued. He was the person who did the hand-to-hand fighting there that we saw commemorated earlier. And our Senator Chuck Schumer had a lot to do with him finally getting that U.S. Medal of Honor about 98 years after his bravery. Now, this has to do with the French falling in love with the African-American soldiers. This is another song sheet here, Goodbye Alexander, Honey. There was this kind of appreciation for African-Americans. They spoke French well. They had a jazz band. We'll talk a lot more about that later. The regimental band for the 369th brought jazz to France, and they fell in love with it. On the right, you have an American magazine cover saying, you know, dark days for France with the soldiers leaving. And you'll see how they racinated the soldiers, making them darker than they actually were. But that's an American magazine. The French did not want them to leave. And when the Harlem Hellfighters came home, there was an enormous parade. This is just for the 369th Regiment. They marched down Fifth Avenue, and they filled the entire avenue. There's a great film of this where you can see them marching. You can see everyone giving them a real hero's welcome. And this wasn't just in New York City. There are many units received welcomes, hero welcomes around the country. Black, but also red, white, and blue is what this reads. And that's the French War Cross behind him, showing the heroism. Another song here, when the good Lord makes a record of a hero's deed, he draws no color line. And this is from New York City. You have a disabled soldier here being thanked by a member of the public, and he was marching using crutches. So they received a hero's welcome. We'll talk in a few minutes about what happened later. Here is Buffalo's own hometown hero, who is very representative in many ways of the African-American soldiers of World War I. This is Jesse W. Clipper. He worked as a waiter. He worked in various other capacities. He lived at 475 Michigan Avenue. He was vice president of the Colored Musicians Club. He had very strong connections with jazz. There's some record that he worked as part of a Dixieland quartet. He married Miss Edna Mercer in 1916. And then in 1917, he served in France as part of the 317th Engineers. He rose to the rank of corporal. He was wounded, he recovered, and he returned to duty. He did not come home. He was gassed in the final days of the war and hospitalized. So this is a very strong war record. He died in France after the end of the war on February 21st, 1919. This is about the same time as that big parade I showed you in my first slide where everyone was cheering the soldiers marching home. And as someone who's worked on the 1918 influenza pandemic, I have to tell you that's also when the second wave of the influenza was passing through Europe. So part of me reads this and think, oh no, he was gassed and then he died in February. Part of me wonders if he died of influenza and pneumonia. But here is his cross in the cemetery in Voisin, France. And this is Reverend Eugene Pierce standing by Corporal Clipper's grave in France, in one of the large American cemeteries in France. Today we remember Corporal Jesse Clipper through the American Legion Post 430 that bears his name, and also a memorial park that is called Jesse Clipper Park. It's on the corner of William Street and Michigan Avenue. And the marker here reads, Jesse Clipper, in memory of the valiant service of Negroes in the wars of these United States of America and the glory of God. And I think this park here has provided a kind of seed, and there's a planning initiative to do a park recognizing African-American servicemen in all-American wars down at the waterfront, I know. I don't know as much about that as I should, but I do think that this Jesse Clipper Park has provided a kind of beginning of that kind of an initiative. Less directly, Jesse Clipper participated in the African-American history of our city, living on Michigan Avenue, which is now the Michigan Avenue African-American Heritage Corridor. You can see here the archway that now marks that. And also being vice president of the Colored Musicians Club, also part of that Michigan Avenue corridor. Well, what happened when these African-American soldiers came marching home? What was their legacy? Despite the pride taken in their accomplishments, returning African-American soldiers faced a backlash, the worst racial violence in many decades. This is just one of many, many newspaper articles. The soldiers' return also coincided with the Great Migration, with many African-American families leaving the agricultural South for the industrialized Midwest and North. Lynchings and race riots rose alarmingly during the Red Summer of 1919. W.E.B. Du Bois exhorted the returning soldiers to fight for democracy in America, to become leaders. He has a wonderful essay called Returning Soldiers, saying you fought for democracy in France. You must fight for democracy in America, or I will know why. And this is the famous sign that flew in Harlem outside the NAACP headquarters. A man was lynched yesterday. And all of this begins in 1919. So what does it mean to fight? Does this fighting have to be physical, or could it take other forms? These are questions that also concerned many writers, artists, and musicians of the period. And here's a sampling of some of the Harlem Renaissance musicians and writers: Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay. In France, and it should be in the US, the Harlem Hellfighters are remembered for their jazz band. If you go to the brand new French Museum of the First World War, they have a whole section on the Harlem Hellfighters band. James Europe Reese was the band leader. He had been a jazz musician in New York City for many years before the war. And they introduced France to jazz music. And France went wild. They enthusiastically embraced this musical form. Here are some photos of James Earl Reese with the band. Here's some of the music, the famous infantry Hellfighters band. During their first concert, right on the pier, right on the dock, he played Stars and Stripes Forever, and the band played the Memphis Blues. The British were not nearly as interested. They were not taken with this, but the French developed a taste for syncopated rhythm that really did not diminish for at least 50 years. Many African-American soldiers also were influenced by French art. Their experience in France really gave them a whole sense of international travel that they probably would never have had. One example example is Palmer Hayden. I included this slide because I think many of you might recognize the painting on the left. The original hangs in the Albright Knox, the Paul Gauguin painting of the young woman dreaming on the bed. Here, what Palmer Hayden has done is he substituted a young African male, and every single thing he's dreaming about relates to perhaps a military band. You see the trumpet, you see the drum, but he's clearly influenced, he's clearly seen the Paul Gauguin. And on the right, a painting entitled Jeunesse 1927. It might be a Harlem Jazz Club, but you can tell by the poem's title, the frieze on the ceiling, he's developed a taste for French culture. There's a number of other painters, but I think this gives you an idea. These soldiers came from very different backgrounds, but the trips to France, he actually served 4 different tours in the Army before coming back to the States to settle down and paint. It gave them a very different sense of potential of what they could do with their lives. So, once nearly forgotten, African-American World War I soldiers provided the foundations for the world we live in today. Their courage, their leadership, their willingness to take enormous chances to improve their lives and the lives of their families, the enduring relationships they formed helped create a more diverse and equal American society. They were heroes in the purest sense of the word. So the top one is a photo taken of a very young African-American soldier enlisting. And my bottom slide, my bottom print, is a 1927 painting of an African-American soldier. And you can see the sort of side eye there. You can see the sort of knowledge gained, I think, in the painting. But the black and white photo there just shows that raw sense of duty and that willingness to do what is ever necessary. So I like those two as sort of bookends of that experience, if you will. So Dennis, I guess I'll turn it back to you.
That was Jane, that was a wonderful program and a great piece of archival history for us to appreciate here in Buffalo, and especially with the new Michigan Street corridor. Melissa, any questions for Jane?
Dennis, we don't have any questions in our chat for Jane.
Okay. I wonder if I found it ironic when we invited you to speak, Jane, there was no pandemic in America. And I'm wondering if your book is available, the one you've written about the subject.
Well, you know, it hasn't gone into paperback yet, but I keep thinking I need to contact my editor because I think it's become a lot more relevant.
I would say.
Yes. When I wrote it, it was before the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
I initially wrote it based on the American Experience, the documentary, The American Experience, which was about the pandemic. And I noticed some parallels to Mrs. Dalloway. I'm a Virginia Woolf critic. I wrote my dissertation on Virginia Woolf. And then I got very interested in the pandemic because there wasn't that much research done on it at that point. And so it was a lot of work doing the research on that. But people kept saying to me, oh, there's nothing on that. You won't find anything on it. Well, the more I sort of dug around, the more I found. There's enormous amounts written about the pandemic, but nobody had ever wanted to research it. I think it was too monumental a trauma. You know, the body counts just keep going up. We're not sure of how many died. We're still not sure. As I was saying about Jesse W. Clipper, everything about his history strongly suggests he died maybe of influenza. But you would have to go and really look at it to know. The body count might have been 60,000. It could have been 80,000. Some people get really enthusiastic and go up to 100,000. I personally think it's around between 60 and 80, but we will never know how many people actually died.
Well, the anniversary obviously was a couple of years ago. I think the CDC had a report out as well. And but you're right, nobody really talked about it, and suddenly it's unfortunately the talk of the town. We'll
Dennis,
hopefully bring you back.
Dennis, we do have one quick question because
Let's
I know
hear
there's only about 1 minute left. What is the title of your book?
It's called Envisioning Disease, Gender, and War, Women's Narratives. What I found as I was looking at literary narratives is that there weren't that many narratives written by men about the war, but there were a large number of women's narratives of the war, of the pandemic, and that they tended to end in these moments of vision, moments of openness and vision. And I connected that with the way women's fortunes basically changed during the war. Men died during World War I at very large numbers. They were at double risk by both the pandemic and the war. But women's suffrage was voted in the Western world during World War I, and women's career paths opened up during World War I. So in all of these narratives, women's lives change, open up at great cost. So I wrote about that. There were greater chances for women, this openness, this vision, hence envisioning. And I followed that all the way through.
This is great, and we're so appreciative of you joining us today. And folks, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We so appreciate this new format, hosting by our Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. Join us next week, same time, same Zoom link, when we talk to architect and author Clinton Brown and his recently published book, Olmsted's Elmwood, The Rise, Decline, and Renewal of Buffalo's Parkway Neighborhood, a Model for America's Cities. Great title, and we'll look forward to that. I'm Dennis Galucki. If you haven't already done so, please vote today to celebrate American democracy. Be well and good day. Wow.